All right, sixth graders, welcome back. This is our second day of reading Dragonwings. We're going to be starting on page 13, so go ahead and turn to page 13 in your books. Just as a refresher, yesterday we learned something really, really important. At the very end of page 12, we find out that through their cousin, whose name is Handclap, he had a letter to give Moonshadow, and the letter was from his father inviting Moonshadow to travel across the ocean to go and live with him in America. And at the very bottom of page 12, it says, I turned to mother and grandmother. I want to go, I said. So Moonshadow has decided to go to America. Let's find out what happens next. So he says, I want to go, page 13. And that was that. I won't go through the tearful goodbyes or the boat ride on the river to Canton, the port city, or the first few days on the demon boat. I was young, and I was homesick, and I was frightened, especially of all the sailors, for they were so tall and big and hairy. I thought they were tiger demons, special tigers with magical powers. Perhaps I should explain here that the Tang word for demon can mean many kinds of supernatural beings. A demon can be the ghost of a dead person, but he can also be a supernatural creature who can use his great powers for good as well as for evil, just like the dragons. It is much trickier to deal with the demon of the Middle Kingdom than an American devil, because you always know that the American devil means you harm. I was frightened, and Handclap did nothing to ease my fear. One fellow passenger remembered a story about demon sailors who had fattened up their Tang passengers. The Tang people had thought it was a good deal, till they were marched off the boat into a butcher's shop. And then Handclap said that was nothing, and went on to talk about a ship of tiger demons who plied their trade between Canton and Hell, delivering the Tang men for work there. Handclap cared little about the truth and loved to let his imagination run wild. He told us about how the sailors had slept upside down on top of their heads with knives between their teeth and so on. So I could not understand his excitement when we neared the land of the demons. To my disappointment, I only saw a brown smudge on the horizon, as the Middle Kingdom had looked from a distance. There was no glittering mound of gold to be seen. And then Handclap took me below to the hold to rehearse my story for the customs demons. It was the one bit of practical advice I ever got from Handclap. When I came to the custom demons, I was to say I was 8 in the demon fashion, instead of 9 as I truly was. I was to use my name in the wrong order, putting my family name after my personal name, as the demons did. Otherwise, the demons would write down the last word they heard, so that I would be called Mr. Shadow instead of Mr. Lee. If I made any of those mistakes, I might not be allowed to land as the son of my father. There was reason to worry, too. For just a few years ago, the demons had broken their own laws and turned away over 20,000 of their former guests who had been expected to be readmitted. This figure does not even reflect the large number of Tang men who could not get into the country for the first time. The demons, it seemed, were determined to cut down on the number of Tang people living on the Golden Mountain. The demons kept us locked inside a long 2-story warehouse for a week before it was our turn to be questioned. I don't like to think about it too much. We were kept on the bottom story where we slept and ate off the floors. All the time we smelled the sewage and the bilge of the bay. Besides which, there were no way to bathe there, So after the long boat voyage, we were a rather fragrant group on our own. Finally, though, when the demons called me for questioning, I found they already had a big bunch of papers on my father. Inside it was the record of his first interview, which ran for some 150 pages. They spent an hour looking at it and then asking me questions about my village and kinsmen. They tried to trip me up so they could prove I was not my father's son. But they did not succeed. Finally, even the demons had to admit that I was who I claimed to be. Then they made me strip naked and took my measurements and poked me all around, and they wrote down all that information on a sheet of paper so that if I ever left the country, no one could sneak back in my place. They put that sheet into a new, turn the page, bunch of papers, which were on me. They also added the notes of our interview to that pile. I only got my first good look at the land of the Golden Mountain when Handclap and I were finally released, and we stood together before the open doorway leading out of the warehouse where all the immigrants were taken. I saw plenty of hills, but not one gold one. And all the demon houses looked so strange. They were box-like in shape, with no courtyards inside them, as if the demons hated fresh air, but liked being shut up in something like a trunk. The houses had almost no ornamentation and were painted in dull colors, when they were painted at all. The little box-like houses seemed so drab to me that I even felt sorry for the demons who lived in them, for they lived like prisoners without even knowing they were in prison. Handclap had already sent word to Father by a friend who had been ahead of us in line and who had been released the day before, so we knew Father and the others would be waiting. I saw the Tang men standing at the foot of the pier before the warehouse. I clutched my wooden box to my chest. It was about the length of my arm and about a third that in width, and it had a cunning metal clasp with a ring at the end. I would hook my finger into the ring and pull it up, and the lid would open almost noiselessly. This was for my valuables. I played with the catch now nervously, studying the men. They were all dressed alike, in either in either denim jackets or the big black loose cotton tunics that reached to their hips and had wide wing-like sleeves. They also wore heavy blue demon trousers of denim. Some of them wore the cotton slipper shoes of the Tang men, while others wore demon boots. They all wore demon hats, with the crowns pushed up full and high and the brims down flat. I found myself wondering which of them were really Tang men and which might be demons in disguise. Handclap waved toward one knot of men. "That's Uncle Brightstar," Handclap pointed at the fat old man. He pointed out the rest of our company. I heard him say that they must not have brought the wagon because of the crowds down here and the long wait for us. "And that tall man there?" Handclap finished, looking at me. "That's your father." I started to run. The others said hello as I went past them, but I ignored them. I held my box so tightly against my chest that it hurt to breathe. Then I looked up at the tall man who stood over me. He was nearly, 5'8", which was tall for a Tang man in those days. He had a long, sharp face with almost elfin eyes. He was my father, and yet he was a stranger to me. I had never seen him. I thought to myself, how can we ever speak to one another? He's as strange to me as a demon. And then my father smiled. "Hello, boy," he said. He knelt down on the pier and held out his arms. "I've waited a long time to do this. Too long." And I dropped my box and ran into his arms. I had arrived. We're going to continue into chapter 2. What a sweet moment between Moonshadow and his father. Chapter 2, The Company. This takes place in April of 1903. "So this is your boy," Uncle Brightstar said. "Yes, Uncle." Father pushed me forward. Uncle studied me as he would a new flat iron, looking for flaws. I stared back at him. They don't make men like Uncle Brightstar anymore. His hands were calloused by mining the California streams for gold, and his left index finger was twisted slightly from an accident when he had been helping to dig tunnels through the mountains for the railroad. Uncle had few classmates left. Classmates was the term which one government official might use for another official who had passed the government exams in the same year as he. But Uncle liked to say that the demons had examined him more rigorously than any government exam. He was in his 80s and short and fat and built like a rock. He had a round face with broad cheeks and a weak chin that made his thick lips seem to protrude even more. His belly stuck out above his pants top. It was usually covered by the loose tunic all the Tang men wore, but today he had worn a special blue silk coat. "Don't you know it's impolite to stare, boy?" Uncle grunted. "Why are you doing it then, sir?" He rapped my forehead with his knuckle. "This boy has character, at least." Everyone laughed, relieved. I had been accepted. Uncle turned to Father. "You're a lucky man, Windrider." "Windrider?" I asked Father. "That's not your name." "It is now," Father said. "I'll explain later." It was a good thing that my father was with me. The thousands of miles I had crossed were nothing compared to the last mile or so between the docks and the town of the Tang people, Chinatown. I kept twisting my head this way and that to look at the hills until Father stopped. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Which one is the Golden Mountain?" Father did not even look at me, but turned around to look at poor Handclap. "Those 2 years in the Middle Kingdom haven't changed you one bit." "Oh, now," Handclap mumbled. He scratched at his neck in embarrassment. "After all, the truth's what you make it." Uncle Brightstar snorted. "It's a good thing you don't keep the books." Father clapped his hand on my shoulder. "Boy, you have to realize that there was never a flea that Handclap didn't call a horse, and there was never a horse that he didn't call an elephant. And there's never been a country big enough to hold the elephant that Handclap has seen." Lefty laughed. He was bent almost double, hefting my straw chest with his good hand and resting on his back. "You mean there's no Golden Mountain?" I was disappointed and felt a little betrayed. "Not that we've ever seen," Uncle Brightstar added more kindly, "though we've often wished it." "Oh," I said in a very small voice. Father took my hand kindly. "But there's a lot left to the demon's land that we haven't seen. Maybe we'll run across it yet. And like I've always said, that will be the day when everyone in the world decides to use copper and not gold for money," Uncle said. "Then we'll look for a mountain of copper." Father laughed. Turn the page. "And we'll let Handclap be our guide," added White Deer. "And I'll guide you, cousins, straight and true," said Handclap. "For there's nothing I can't do. I can dig up a mountain, drink up a lake, outrun the wind." Handclap rambled on. Father took the opportunity to whisper to me, "Stick close to me, Moonshadow, and don't be afraid." To get to the Tang people's town, you see, we had to pass through the Barbary Coast, a place filled with brothels and saloons and gambling joints. Walking up the street, I nearly lost heart. To me, the wooden houses seemed like shells of wood, which terrible monsters had spun about themselves. It seemed as if the monsters would break out any moment through the wooden walls and grab me. One demon building in particular was very bad. It was only a saloon, I learned later. But it seemed terrible to me. It reeked of vomit and cheap liquor and stale sweat. For a long time, I would associate this smell with the homes of the demons. A young white demon pushed through its doors. He was in strange clothes of black and white that were obviously dress-up. I wondered if he were some kind of special demon. I watched as he stumbled into the railing before the saloon and quietly sat down. His eyes crossed. "What are you looking at, you little," it sounded like, "China man?" I looked at Father for translation, but he had grown angry. Uncle Brightstar stepped in between us and bowed. "No sabe, so sorry." And others gathered around us began pushing us up the steep hill toward the safety of the town of the Tang people. Suddenly I felt as if I had come home. I can see the town of the Tang people even now in the late afternoon sun, not as it is now, full of the souvenir shops and neon signs, but as it was then. The houses and the stores had all the right colors and shapes, for they had been built not by demons, but by the Tang people. It looked much like the streets in Canton, the city in the Middle Kingdom from which I had sailed. The roofs of the buildings were tiled and arched, and the walls, windows, and doorways were in gold or red or green. Before the fronts of the buildings were sensible life safeguards against demons of any kind. There were lions lying down protectively before some. Other houses had pictures of the door guardians on their doors, and still others had scrolls of red paper on the doorways, asking a certain god to protect the inhabitants against demons. On the blank walls of some buildings were long, narrow strips of red paper, upon which words had been painted in thick black ink. My father told me that some of them were advertisements, offering a heavy winter coat for sale, or somebody's services in writing a letter home, or perhaps a request to buy a demon watch. Above the posters and storefronts were balconies, upon which men lounged, their faces turned toward the sun and their shadows arching behind them on the walls like long tails. There was a breeze blowing down the hill, and the men had gathered outside, standing on the sidewalks, their hands behind their backs, talking amiably. In their dark tunics and pants, they looked like shadows, a street of shadows, flitting here and there, talking in high, loud, excited voices. People who think the Tang people are quiet and never listen to us on our own homes, where the conversation is carried on at the level of a shout. And from some room far above the street came the lonely, peaceful sound of a moon guitar. The streets were narrow, and the tall, 3-story buildings on either side of them made them seem narrower. Vendors shuffled along in the dusty streets because of the sidewalks were too crowded. Over the shoulders of the vendors and had heavy poles from which they balanced baskets at either end, some with vegetables, others with pastries or candies or toys. Their loads seemed heavy enough until the demon wagons rolled toward them, pulled by the huge-bodied demon horses, with their breaths blowing and the sweat glistening on their flanks. Then the vendors had to dodge nimbly to avoid being trampled under the heavy hooves, while the demon drivers shouted largely unintelligible curses at them. There were groceries and herbal shops, clothing shops and laundries, halls that housed the brotherhoods or the district associations or the offices of family clans. Uncle pointed out that the building of the district from which my family came and to which I could go to for help. Besides that, there was the Lee family building, which would help everyone who was named Lee. But most interesting to me were the men who sold their products from the stalls on the street. There was a butcher who worked in the mouth of a narrow alley. Behind the butcher were cages with fresh chickens waiting to be killed for the buyer. And before him was a big zinc wash basin filled with fresh fish. In one cage by his feet was a wildcat for some man who wanted to regain some of his youthful vigor. There were men in long, narrow stalls set against the sides of buildings who sold toys and different candies. One, a type of sweet but hot-tasting candied ginger that, turn the page, was a bright orange-red in color. There were dried fruits that you could buy, sweet, semi-sweet, or salty. These you sucked inside your mouth till all the flavor was gone, and then you stripped the moistened meat away from the seed. There were apricot candies, pressed flat into wafers, thin, white, curled strips of coconut candy, several kinds of disc-like rice cookies, and so on. And in the doorways, men sat on the stoop selling various newspapers gathered in piles around them. I should say now that there were no women on the streets, only men, thousands of men, and perhaps carefully locked away in the buildings might be a few hundred Tang women. Most of the women who came to the demon land were prostitutes. Oh, there were a few rich merchants who had brought their wives over with their maids, but these were the exceptions, and the wives had to be locked up even more carefully than the prostitutes to keep them from being kidnapped by some brotherhood and put to work in a brothel in another city. We stopped before a small, neat 3-story building painted bright red and green. On the front of the building was a huge sign on which were painted Tang people's symbols and demon words, announcing to the whole wide world that this was the Company of the Peach Orchard Vow. The demons always thought the name was funny. Uncle let them laugh. It was Uncle who told me that the Peach Orchard Vow was a famous vow, taken by the man who became the god of war and his 2 sworn brothers to serve the people and help one another. On the door were painted the names of the 2 door guardians who kept the demons away. And on the windows were painted the words for long life and prosperity. With a flourish, Uncle opened the front door for me and ushered me inside. "A superior home for superior men," he said. Uncle was fond of the phrase, "the superior man," which he said he had taken from the wise man Confucius. That's where we're going to stop there today, 6th graders. We're going to pick up and see what the inside of their company building looks like tomorrow.